Support for This News is So Gay comes from the LGBTQ Opportunity Fund of the Cleveland Foundation, leveraging philanthropy to empower LGBTQ communities. Welcome to This News is So Gay. I'm Ken Schneck, editor of the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ newsroom. Thanks so much for joining us. The Supreme Court issued a slew of rulings last week, including some LGBTQ related decisions that experts say will have far-reaching effects for our community. So how is life going to change? Pride Month has officially come to a close. Many LGBTQ advocates say that Pride 2025 needed to look different, but did it? Marriage equality is officially 10 years old, but some LGBTQ folks say it is far from settled law. What actually is on the horizon? And some recent White House press conferences definitely had some strong language in them. Joining us to talk this week about these stories and so much more are LGBTQ reporter for the 19th, Orion Rummler. Hello, Orion.
Hey, Ken, great to be here.
Executive Director of Queer Kentucky, and I must say, a Grand Marshal of the Cincinnati Pride Parade, Missy Spears. Hi, Missy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And editor-in-chief and founder of Lookout, Arizona's statewide LGBTQ newsroom, Joseph Darius Jaafari. Great to see you, Joseph.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
We are now all assembled, so let's dive in. The entire nation was in full reaction mode last Friday as the Supreme Court released one decision after another affecting historically marginalized populations, including opinions on birthright citizenship and abortion access. Included in the list of rulings were a pair of specifically LGBTQ related decisions that are a bit of a mixed bag for our community. Let's talk about them. Orion, let's start with Mahmoud versus Taylor. Can you give us a brief sketch of that case and what the Supreme Court there decided?
So this was a fascinating case. It's not about book bans, but it's related to that. This case was a group of Maryland parents who say their elementary age kids are being compelled by Montgomery County in Maryland, compelled by the county to learn about gender and sexuality against their religious beliefs. The parents were not asking for books to be banned, but they were saying, we want to opt our kids out of reading these books based on religious beliefs. And, unsurprisingly, the Supreme Court sided with these parents. This was a win for religious liberty advocates. It potentially alters the course of public education nationwide, including at a time when, some conservatives want Bibles back in schools. I will note that there were plenty of religious groups who also opposed what these Maryland parents were saying. Although these Maryland parents were saying, according to our religious beliefs, we don't want our kids to be exposed to LGBTQ books, there were religious groups, including religious LGBTQ groups, who were like, no, these books are fine. And the books at the center of this case were actually honestly pretty funny in how innocuous they are. Like in one children's book, it's about a family dog getting lost at a pride parade. And another book I was about intersectional feminism. I couldn't actually find any LGBTQ references in that one. But anyway, this case is going to have effects on how students are taught, how much power religious parents can exercise in what their kids are taught.
Now I need to know if they found the dog at the Pride Parade. I assume that's how the book ended, but I have not read it. How about the dissenters on the court? It was a 6-3 decision, which I feel like we don't even need to say anymore. Odds are that a Supreme Court decision is 6-3. But what were the dissenters' take on this case?
Sure. So Sotomayor, as per usual, she had a really eloquent dissent where she's explaining the broad impact of this ruling. The way she put it is today's ruling ushers in a new reality. She was arguing that the court was casting aside longstanding precedent, and that the idea of exposing students to the simple message that LGBTQ people exist should not be enough to trigger this kind of judicial scrutiny.
How were LGBTQ orgs responding to this decision?
Well, they're pointing out that this is part of a wider movement right now to increase how the idea of religious liberty can be used to curb LGBTQ rights, because we have been seeing more of this in states So that's what a lot of them are talking about how this case is like it's going to be dangerous to LGBTQ kids in schools who have like for the past 5 years have really been getting the message that there is something wrong with them, or if their parents are LGBTQ, like just getting a lot of political rhetoric and messaging that's like telling them like there's something wrong with you. So they're concerned about how queer kids or just kids with gay parents may feel like if they're in a classroom and they're told like we can't read this book anymore because it has people like you in it.
Can I jump in and add some context to the last case that we were talking about?
Please.
That really, the case was really about opt-out versus, whether or not a child should just do the course as demanded through the curriculum. And so opt-out is a fairly common standard in a lot of school districts across the country for a variety of things, not just reading materials. I opted out of biology class from dissecting a rat, for example, because I was vegan at the time. So that's a good example of how opt-out is used. But it's different that a lot of conservative run states have now decided to do opt-in education. We have this in Arizona. There's a number of states that have this with parental rights laws across the nation. And what we've seen there is that it actually causes a more fractured education. So the best way to think of this is, the case is about opt-in, but there's a number of states that even don't have this. They have that opt-out standard, which essentially says your child is receiving this education. Sign this piece of paper if you don't want your kid to be a part of it, which makes it a harder burden on administrations. And the best way to think about it is if a class is going on a field trip, the default in an opt-out district would be that your child is going, and in the event you don't want your kid to go, you sign a piece of paperwork your kid has to turn in. You may only get a couple of kids who don't want to go on that trip. But in an opt-in situation, which is what we're seeing moving forward, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see it again in the future, the field trip is really predicated on how many kids' parents sign the permission slip. And because of a variety of factors, you will get a lot more students not going. So what we've seen in states like here in Arizona and Florida is that it's easier just to not take the field trip altogether than deal with having to find a separate thing to do for the large number of kids who may not be going on that trip. And so I just want to add that context because I think now that we've had this conversation about opting out, I wouldn't be shocked if opt-in is the next wave of conservative policies that we see in school education, which makes it harder to teach LGBTQ issues, sex education, all this sort of stuff.
On the flip side, the Supreme Court had slightly better news with Kennedy versus Braidwood and free access to PrEP under the Affordable Care Act. Joseph, can you give us a quick rundown on that case?
Yeah, so this case is really focused around a task force that is appointed by the government that deems what care is considered preventative. Things like diabetes screenings or colorectal cancer screenings. That task force is voluntary. And when the Affordable Care Act was enacted, it required that the recommendations of that task force for preventative care be free for patients. The reason why this was on the radar for LGBTQ plus advocates and specifically HIV and AIDS medical professionals is that a part of the task force's recommendations for HIV prevention is pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP, which protects people who use it correctly from HIV by more than 99%. So the company that brought this case forward is a health management company of about 70 employees called Braidwood Management, as well as 6 other Christian organizations, including a dental practice, which said that the task force that makes those decisions should not be in charge because it violated the appointments clause, which lays out how people are put into positions of power, in this case, a task force. So they argued that the task force needed to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, very similarly to what we see with cabinet members. They also made claims for religious liberty under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that they didn't want to cover PrEP specifically. But the case at hand is really narrow in talking about the makeup of the task force and if they have the power to make those choices for what should be covered and if people should be getting it for free. So health advocates across the board were worried because if the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Braidwood, a number of preventable medical screenings would no longer be covered. And I wrote down a few of the things that were at stake. So lung cancer screening for people over 50 years old who have a history of smoking, women over 35 who are at increased risk of breast cancer, and perinatal depression interventions for pregnancy, and of course, HIV prevention services. So the decision was 6-3, with 3 conservatives enjoining the 3 liberal justices, with the other conservatives in dissent. The rest were on board. So essentially saying the members of the task force are allowed to exist at the will of the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, which we know is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, this decision comes at a time when HIV-related services are just not in a great place right now, amidst all the questions about the future of the Ryan White Care Act and all the coverage that that act provides. I was reading about how HIV testing is at risk in Arizona.
Yeah, so the core elements of Ryan White really aren't at risk. And for those who don't know what Ryan White funding, it's national funding for people who are living with HIV who maybe need more assistance, lower income folk. The core of that is not really being threatened, but what is being threatened is housing assistance and dental coverage, services where people living with HIV are more at risk of being denied because of stigma or misinformation on the virus. What really is at risk and what we're seeing kind of affect, a number of different states when it comes to HIV testing is how the federal budget as it stands, how it slashes CDC funding for almost all HIV services outside of a very specific $300 million for about 57 jurisdictions across the country. Now, keep in mind that the CDC is one of the largest funders for HIV services across the country. And the worry here with the new budget is that if it goes through, places like New York, San Francisco, Dallas, Phoenix, those places will get a large slice of money to help with services. But that leaves out an incredibly large number of Americans who are at risk living in areas outside of just those 57 jurisdictions. That includes testing, that includes PrEP access. And for example, in Arizona, Maricopa County has the largest number of people living with HIV or accessing HIV preventative care. But it's also, the numbers show that because it's home of one of the nation's largest cities. However, when you break it down, our rural counties, which are not part of those 57 jurisdictions, have incredibly high transmission rates when you break it down per 100,000. And as we know, how viruses and outbreaks work, ignoring what happens in one part almost certainly leads to complications in other areas.
And obviously, these are not the only major LGBTQ plus related Supreme Court decisions here during Pride Month. In what already seems like forever ago, a decision on June 18th has far-reaching effects for gender-affirming care. Missy, can you give us the quick Skirmetti rundown that we all need to know?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in 2023, Tennessee passed its Senate Bill 1, which essentially blocks gender affirming care for trans youth in the state. It was quickly challenged in court when it ended up in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. That judge ended up permitting the entire law to go into effect. But what they also did is they combined that case with the case from Kentucky, where we were appealing good old Senate Bill 150 that also came out in 2023 and was considered the most extreme anti-trans bill at the time. The case, as you said, just made its way to the Supreme Court, and it kind of centered on whether the law discriminated against based on sex or transgender status. And unfortunately, over a week ago, the court sided with Tennessee's argument that the law targeted specific medical treatments rather than discrimination against transgender individuals. The vote was 6-3, and it means that the laws in Kentucky and Tennessee stay in place, and the fight gets a little bit harder for everyone else, especially the 25 states that have seen anti-trans bills pass since 2021.
And we have the proliferation of gender-affirming care bans that are cross-pollinating in state after state. So in addition to 150, you also have HB 495 there in Kentucky. It sounds like that's causing some confusion there in the Bluegrass State, Missy?
Yeah, HB 495 was a bill that was passed during our General Assembly. Kentucky is a part-time assembly that met between January and March of this year. And 495 essentially did two things. The first thing was it got rid of Andy Beshear's ban on conversion therapy. So that went into effect immediately. The other part of the bill was that it was removing a lot of gender-affirming care that people were accessing through Medicaid. And Kentucky is one of the poorest states in the country. I believe we are number 7 in poverty. 1 out of every 3 residents is on Medicaid. So it is definitely something that affects a lot of trans individuals in our state. What's happening, though, is that when they pass this law, they have a responsibility to add the funding for it. Beshear's office has looked it over and determined that it adds approximately around $7 million to our budget, and there was no money set aside for that. So right now, the confusion is whether or not it's actually going to be enforced. Beshear is threatening not to enforce it, saying that it wasn't done properly. Lawmakers are saying if he does not enforce it, they have ways that they can go after him. And in the middle of it are caught trans individuals and families who really don't know what's going to happen to their care.
And similar news there in Arizona, it looks like, Joseph, about gender-affirming care bans, care just being completely canceled there as well, as it is here in Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, Arizona has had a ban on surgeries for transgender youth for about 5 years now. But what we're seeing now is the state's largest providers of medical treatment outside of therapy, so hormones or puberty blockers, being removed from care, even though people don't have to, even though organizations don't have to. So I spoke with people in Tucson, for example, where the area's largest provider of trans care slash all their care for transgender people, not just youth. As a result, we've spoken to people who are working to figure out what are they going to do? Are they going to cross the border to get medicines because Tucson's an hour away from the border, get it shipped from other places? There's a lot of people who we talk to are also stockpiling their medication or like getting stuff from other areas and stockpiling that. So it's caused a lot of confusion.
Orion, it looks like there's a little bit of a cause for hope. You spoke with some LGBTQ plus attorneys who said that we should have some hope.
I was kind of surprised about this too. Basically, the Skermeti ruling was not as bad and broad as it could have been. It was not the worst case scenario ruling that some attorneys were worried about. This was a painful blow to families of trans youth, which it is really painful. But within the ruling, LGBTQ rights attorneys have been talking about there are still some openings within the ruling to keep fighting gender affirming care bans and other anti-trans laws. I don't want to go too into the weeds, but some of the ways the ruling is narrow is, the justices, they did determine that Tennessee's law does not discriminate against transgender minors, which is not the outcome that LGBTQ rights attorneys wanted. But through delivering this loss to LGBTQ advocates and these families of trans youth, the ruling did not address some of these bigger questions that could have additionally significantly set back trans rights as a whole.
You are listening to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck. We are joined this week by Orion Rummler from the 19th, Missy Spears from Queer Kentucky, and Joseph Darius Jaafari of Lookout. Pride Month is now officially closed. Well, kind of. I know here in Ohio we have at least 15 Pride celebrations left and many more across the country, but the bulk of them have passed, and many report that the celebrations felt a little bit different than they did last year. Missy, Cincinnati made headlines alongside St. Paul and some other Prides in both divesting from corporate dollars and asking the community to step up their financial support, which Cincinnati, the local community, raised even more than they were looking for to cover the stopgap for divesting from corporate support. Did you notice anything different when you were there again as one of the grand marshals of the Cincinnati Pride Parade?
Yes and no. First, the event looked the same. The event looked great. Cincinnati Pride, it's a gorgeous pride that they put on. There was a lot of community spirit. You could definitely tell people were reacting and coming together after everything that's been happening this year to the queer community. They got an influx of volunteers, more than they thought, which was great. And then, in the parade itself, great mix of folks from local nonprofits and leaders to the kink community, religious folks, socialist groups, and not as many protesters as you would have thought this year. What did feel different, though, were the conversations happening in the background around corporate money. Just to kind of reiterate what Ken was saying, Cincinnati turned down some sponsors this year that had dropped DEI practices, and they made up that lost $50,000 through basically a GoFundMe online. They also raised some additional money, which they added to their community giving program. They currently give, I believe, around $30,000 to $40,000 in money to the community every year and $2,500 grants, which is great. And what this has really done is first it's kicked off a conversation in smaller communities outside of Cincinnati, going through Kentucky this Pride season and rural communities where the median income might be $20,000. It's really started a conversation there about corporate giving and how they don't have the luxury of turning things down. And it really kind of adds some nuance to the conversation. And then up here in Cincinnati, when you kind of combine what you said earlier about the Ryan White grant money going away, it started a conversation of, is this the right time to turn away funds from our community? Is it better off to turn down the money or maybe to accept it and reroute it towards those organizations that are losing it right now? So it's nuanced, it's heavy, but it's been an interesting conversation to watch happen.
More importantly, did you drive down the street in a car and wave to people? Because that's really what I care about here. Did that happen?
I did.
Okay, good.
I waved. I passed out stickers. It was fun.
Do you have the perfect wave?
Oh, my wave was so bad. I was really insecure about my wave. So I was working on it throughout.
We will be working on Missy's wave offline. There were also a ton of protests and even one notable show of force. Joseph, what happened in Bisbee?
Sure. So, for people who don't know, Bisbee is this small mining town about an hour, 2 hours east of Tucson, about an hour north of the Mexico border. It's very well known as this small artist queer haven in the desert, surrounded by really ultra conservative legislators and the communities. But what happened there is it's one of the largest, one of the most popular, I wouldn't say the largest, one of the most popular Pride festivals in the state of Arizona. And people were really blindsided because Border Patrol agents were at the Pride Festival and made 2 detainments. And it caused a lot of anxiety for some of the people in attendance to witness the arrests. We were there. We had a reporter down there who went and reported on the arrest and talked to people about kind of the outcome of it. And the big kind of takeaway was people were going to celebrate joy and happiness and all the things that we kind of relate with Pride, and then kind of walked away with a lot of fear.
Well, still more Pride to go. And another issue of Pride, that would be marriage equality. 10 years ago, last week, the Supreme Court handed down their decision establishing marriage equality all throughout the nation. It was a huge moment for the community. I remember I was sitting here in Cleveland at a Subaru dealership when I heard the decision, and that felt strangely gay and strangely appropriate. Ohio's own Jim Obergefell was on quite the press tour these past few weeks, and many of you all spoke with him. Orion, talk about Jim's own love story. Why is that important for us to know?
Thank you so much, Ken. Yeah, my colleague Kate Sazin spoke with Jim recently for our newsroom, and I think it's really important for all of us to reflect on Jim's love story with his late husband, because to me, I think it reflects like the personal cost that some of us take to put the movement forward. Like for Jim, like his partner Arthur died before we got the Obergefell ruling, which most people know, but I think it's worth revisiting. Like this Supreme Court case changed how queer people can plan for their futures, like not just getting married, but how can you plan retirement with the person you love? How can you start to build a family? Like the marriage equality ruling set the foundation to give us a lot of rights, but for Jim, like this was upholding the legacy of the man he loved, but the man he loved was already gone, and that was part of the focus of Kate's conversation with Jim that really stuck with me. That this is the 10-year anniversary of this historic ruling, and it's 12 years since Jim lost Arthur, and I think it's important to keep in mind the personal stories involved in our history.
And Missy, you spoke with Jim as well. I was really struck by your question on cultural backlash and what Jim had to say about that. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I was so excited to talk to Jim. Anytime I hear him speak on a panel or an event, you always catch some great stuff because he really dives into queer history and loves to speak from it. In the interview with him, he talked a bit about a very strong anti-gay law that went into effect in Cincinnati in the 1990s, and how that was somewhat a little bit of backlash from some of the empathy and love that the queer community started to feel after the AIDS epidemic in the mid 90s. So they started to feel some love, and then all of a sudden, there's this new anti-gay law. We talked a little bit about how that was repealed in 2004, which was also the same year that dozens of states were passing their same-sex marriage constitutional bans. It's always whiplash for our community. Anytime we get something positive, we tend to take a step back. He immediately noted that Kim Davis took about like a week to come along after his landmark ruling. And I feel like he was absolutely right to use the pie analogy. People feel like equality, if you give someone else a piece that they're losing something. There's just a real fear of like inclusivity, DEI, and just like acknowledging someone that's not a part of a group that you're not in.
I will say that I moderated a book talk with Jim Obergefell and Nico Lang a few weeks ago, and a young trans librarian walked up shyly to Jim and said, "Can I please ask you something?" And Jim said, "Yes, absolutely." And I sat there and thought, I'm about to be here for the most beautiful moment that's ever happened in queer history. And the librarian said, "Is there any way that you have the Wi-Fi password here at this bar?" And it was beautiful. It was a really beautiful moment for our whole community.
Oh my God.
On the other side, many are advising that people still get their marriage documents in order. And I know Lookout had a piece on this, Joseph, about the importance of the logistics of folks protecting the relationships that they're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall takeaway with these conversations, I feel left out. Like I'm the only person here who hasn't talked to Jim, so I need to call this man immediately. But I think the overall takeaway is that legal experts in general have been telling us kind of time and time again. They say that an overturning of a Bergfell is not likely. But I think that doesn't necessarily speak to the anxieties of the community and people who are married right now or wanting to get married, which saw long-standing precedent with Roe v. Wade get overturned, and then looking at something like Obergefell, which is much younger, and a Supreme Court that has really tossed out a lot of precedent, both old and new, and remade what the legal landscape of the country looks like. So with that said, though, they're still saying get your documents in place, which is a good idea in general in the event of an emergency. So they're saying, living wills, medical directives, estate documents, all the things that you would need to make decisions for your family and ensure your finances remain intact and not at risk in a worst case scenario. That's kind of what they're saying, is that, even though this may not be likely, we'll see, there's no harm in making sure that you have everything in place in the event you live in a state that doesn't have same-sex marriage rights.
Get your documents in order, folks. If you want to find some great examples of anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment, apparently you don't need to look much further than White House press conferences. Orion, what happened last week? There were a pair of them last week. What happened with President Trump at a press conference just last week?
So this was pretty interesting to try and untangle it in a way that makes sense. So, one of the Supreme Court rulings we just got was on birthright citizenship. And at a White House press briefing recently, Trump was bringing up this ruling. Like, the way he was portraying it was as if the Supreme Court ruling gives the Trump administration the ability to fight back against any policy or case where a judge has instituted a nationwide injunction or block on the Trump administration from doing something. So Trump got on the White House podium and, he was, saying like, thanks to this decision, now we can fight back on all these issues where the administration has been blocked, including stopping taxpayer funding for gender affirming care. Obviously, the Supreme Court ruling is more complicated than that. And once again, the Supreme Court ruling was about birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court ruling, it was also about nationwide injunctions. That's part of how the justices wrote this ruling, was to, grant the administration's request to partially pause rulings by, in this case, 3 federal judges that had blocked Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship. So again, this is it's about this specific policy. There are some concerns about how this case could affect nationwide injunctions in other areas, but I would not say that Trump was accurately portraying what this Supreme Court decision means. However, I would also note that part of why I thought this was interesting is just because it signals, once again, how much of a priority trans issues are for this administration. Because in my mind, this just comes up again and again. Trump or someone in his administration is talking about immigration, they bring up trans people. It's just not related. So that is interesting to me, that he indicated that this is something in his administration that he really wants to fight back on and prioritize, considering the small number of trans people there are and the even smaller number of trans people who get gender affirming care.
And that's not all from last week. The day before, the Secretary of Defense had quite a few things to say. What came out of his mouth, Missy?
Yeah, so for anyone that missed it, our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had what was described as a meltdown during a press conference when being asked some basic questions around the recent military strikes in Iran. One question in particular concerned the messaging that they were sending out congratulating folks, where they referred to, I believe, boys and bombers. And a reporter asked about that, and he did not take it very well. It definitely brought me back to far back times of February when we had the press conference with Secretary of Transportation and former MTV Road Rules star Sean Duffy when they were talking about DEI and how that was to blame for the multiple plane crashes that have happened. So this honestly just felt like a natural progression.
And his response was so fascinating to me because he pushed back against his own Fox News colleague and then also said, we don't care who's in the cockpit. They're there to defend our country. They're there to advance what we're trying to advance. And I sat there at my computer and just yelled out, well, wait a second. You do care because you're not letting trans people serve openly in the military. So it's not just who's sitting there and who's qualified. Have you all had a press conference like that where I had to, by the way, remind myself I was sitting at home watching this and not yelling at an actual press conference? I've only had a few experiences where I wanted to just yell back. That's a hard one. Have any of you had? Joseph, you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to take away during these kinds of press conferences is that they're often not great gotcha moments, especially for reporters. Because the administration or whoever is putting on that presser ends up always having the power in those moments at the end of the day. That being said, I feel like our job in those moments is to kind of keep pressing and challenge narratives that are being told from the podium. I personally think our biggest problem is asking general questions and not specific ones. So for example, what is the number of youth surgeries in the US and why is it in the interest of the federal government to spend so much money and taxpayer dollars on a strikingly small number of people in the population? Like, what's the end goal here? And so asking very specific questions and getting data from them and getting numbers and cornering them using facts instead of these broad questions is kind of what our purpose is in those moments. But I feel like oftentimes we don't get those opportunities and we just kind of ask general questions.
Well, pushback is not just against Republicans. There's quite a bit of pushback against Democrats who are not evidencing full LGBTQ plus support. And that includes Joseph, an LGBTQ plus progressive in Arizona. Tell us about him.
Arizona Senator Ruben Gallego said in an interview with The Dispatch, I want to say it was a month ago at this point, that he thinks that transgender youth don't belong in sports, specifically singling out transgender girls. And it's an interesting thing for him to say publicly because this guy made a campaign as being a fierce progressive, not a moderate. And so when we spoke with supporters of his and even organizations that endorsed him, they were all taken aback. And they kind of say it's either Gallego showing his true colors and maybe being more of the Kirsten Sinema that he railed against and tried to say that she wasn't standing in alignment with progressive values. Or I think there's a lot of conversation on the national level, which says that he's playing into politics and trying to make a bid for a presidential candidacy where he thinks he needs to be more centrist in order to win Republican or centrist votes. So there's been a lot of backlash against him locally.
Missy, that sounds a lot like the pushback against California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Oh, completely. Almost perfectly mirrors it. Newsom is definitely the most high-profile Democrat that has spoken out against trans rights. He recently had Charlie Kirk on his podcast. Also, Newsom is a Democrat who's probably running for president because he's launched a podcast, as have so many others. And on the podcast, Newsom and Kirk discussed trans in sports. And Newsom went on to agree with Kirk. Having trans individuals in sports is a fairness issue, that he was on the same page as him with that. And it was definitely eye-opening to see one of our top Democratic leaders speak out against trans rights. And that seems to kind of be what's happening. Even our own Governor Beshear, who's been praised with how he communicates around trans and queer issues. A couple months earlier, he quietly let an anti-trans bill regarding inmate care become law without vetoing it when he could have. So it's going to be something to pay attention to as the presidential race gets closer.
And I do want to note here that Missy just outed me in launching this podcast. I am indeed announcing my candidacy for absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Not another white guy with a podcast.
No shortage.
This is a good podcast.
Well, Orion, back in February, you spoke with Representative Sarah McBride, and I highly encourage everyone to check out that piece. It was masterfully done. She is the highest ranking trans representative in the country. What lessons did she have for us?
For McBride, this is something that's been on my mind since I was with her on the campaign trail last fall. She was running for office and is now in office in Congress at a time when Congress is more explicitly anti-trans than it's ever been, when the Trump administration was getting ready to be so anti-trans. Just a very volatile, hostile moment for trans and LGBTQ people, and she's one of the most public facing trans people in the country now because of her office. And back in February, we were just talking about how she's navigating that because, she's been very consistent in the fact that she was elected to represent Delaware, and that is her priority. As like she's not going to take up every fight that transgender Americans want her to, but she's also at this moment like kind of being asked to speak on behalf of trans people because of how bad the political situation is for trans people. And when we were talking in February, the way she's trying to make change right now is to choose her battles wisely. And she believes LGBTQ plus movement should do that too. I mean, for her, what it looks like is like not fighting every time the Republicans do something to rile her up or to try to, which I don't think they've done in a while. But before she even got into office, they were banning her from the bathroom, and like she wasn't even in office yet. She's trying to not let Republicans dictate what her focus or agenda is. And one of the things we spoke about that was notable to me is when House Republicans pushed a trans sports ban. I was there in Congress. I was watching House Democrats for the first time actually got together to have like a cohesive response. It was notable to me because all these Democrats were on the floor against this bill, but McBride was not one of them. She was not one of the Democrats speaking out against this bill. And I asked her about that, and she said, I'm not going to let Republicans dictate what the first floor speech by a trans person in Congress will be. So as McBride's making these decisions, she's making it for Delaware. She's also aware that the eye of history is on her for like everything she says and does.
Finally, in some cultural news that set gays a-screamin', Dolly Parton's 6-show residency sold out in, I think it was a little under 90 minutes. Ticketmaster said, quote, "The demand far exceeded the available tickets, and there are no more tickets available at this time." It begs the question who you all would shell out big bucks to go see in Vegas and why. Joseph, who would you shell out money for?
I was hoping you wouldn't call on me. I'm not a Vegas guy. And I actually have always preferred smaller shows and venues rather than stadiums. So I would not spend my money on any of them. I would just spend my money at the gay bar.
There it is. Missy Spears, who would you shell out the money for a Vegas residency?
I actually just went to Vegas and did this. I took a couple edibles and got a front row seat to David Copperfield, and it was incredible.
Amazing. Orion, who would you go see?
Now I want to say David Copperfield on edibles. Personally, I love Bruce Springsteen. I would pay good money to see him. And I think he's on tour because he'll never die. So
that is after, as a New Jersey boy, that is after my own heart. But the correct answer is, of course, the Indigo Girls. Let's do some quick hits on stories really quick that you all are working on that you're excited about. Orion, what's coming up for you at the 19th?
Yeah, so today I just published a story I'm really proud of. I spoke with LGBTQ comedians about how they are basically laughing off the darkness creeping in on everyday life, how they're trying to use humor to dilute fear in the community. And I just really enjoyed talking with them, trans and queer comedians who, their stars are rising at a time when their rights are under attack. It was very cathartic to write, and I hope to read.
I love that. Missy Spears, what do you got coming up at Queer Kentucky?
Yeah, so, talk about Pride, you talk about corporate dollars, and what goes better than that than do cops belong at Pride? So we released an investigative story at right before Northern Kentucky Pride that involved the LGBTQ liaison officer to Covington, who had recently came out that he had been sued 5 times for civil rights violations in the last 4 years. That deep dive took us to his 300-page personal file, and we covered all of that. So over the past month, we've just been doing follow-ups on that. We've been following how cops have been used in different prides across the state. We have a story coming out just kind of comparing how different pride organizations, approach that. And then we're also following up the Covington story. We're seeing, right now we're looking at the community response and seeing what the city and Northern Kentucky Pride are looking to do with what's happened.
And Joseph, how about for you at Lookout?
This week, we're actually publishing a story on how our governor has helped pass through a slate of bills that mirror Project 2025 or the Heritage Foundation. I'm sure we'll get a lot of flack for that. We're also doing a lot of work looking at medical care and treatment of people living with HIV in prisons and ICE detention facilities across the state, and we're doing that in partnership with the Counter Narrative Project. So those projects are all coming up in the next few months.
All pieces that we all need to check out. I want to thank this week's panel, Orion Rummler from the 19th, Missy Spears from Queer Kentucky and Grand Marshal of the Cincinnati Pride Parade, and Joseph Darius Jaafari of Lookout. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you so much.
That's all we have time for on this week's episode. We will, of course, be back with more news next week. If you like the show, please share it with a friend and subscribe so you do not miss out on our next episode. In the meantime, read LGBTQ plus news, share the stories of LGBTQ plus reporters, and support the work of LGBTQ plus newsrooms. Until next week, friends.